Hello, class, and welcome to Lab 3. Today we're diving into sedimentary rocks, their types, how they form, and what they can tell us about Earth's history. Sedimentary rocks cover about 75% of Earth's surface. You've seen them in iconic places like the Grand Canyon, Hocking Hills, and in the Bonneville Salt Flats. These rocks record environments from deserts to rivers to oceans. There are three main types of sedimentary rocks. We have detrital or clastic, chemical, and biochemical. Each forms differently, and by studying their texture and composition, we can interpret their origins. Detrital rocks form from fragments or other rocks, and therefore are completely inorganic. These fragments go through weathering, transport, deposition, and lithification. For example, granite breaks down into sand grains that eventually become sandstone through lithification. Next, we will look into each of these processes a bit more in depth. Weathering breaks down rocks into smaller pieces, and it happens differently depending on the environment. In places with freeze-thaw cycles, water freezes in cracks and expands, causing the rock to split apart. Along coastlines, waves repeatedly slam into cliffs, and the force of the water plus the grinding of the sand slowly breaks pieces away. In deserts and rivers, wind and flowing water act like sandpaper, carrying sediments that scrape against rock and wear it down over time. Once rocks are weathered, the sediments can be transported by wind or water. Their shape and size change as they move. Large, angular grains usually stay close to their source, while smaller, rounded grains have traveled farther. Sediments settle when energy in the environment drops. Larger grains like gravel settle in high-energy settings, while fine grains like clay settle in low-energy environments. Grain size and shape help us interpret these conditions, and it's important to remember that even large grains can be rounded. After deposition, erosion can still continue to wear down the grains, rounding off their edges over time. Here is another visual example of how different sediment sizes settle in high versus low energy environments. Near the top, just below the mountains, you can find large, angular boulders. Moving something that big and angular requires a lot of energy. Further downstream, you see smaller cobbles that can be carried by a fast-moving river. Then gravel that moves in a slower current, and finally sand that can be transported by the slowest parts of a river or stream. The finest sediments, like silt and clay, only settle in very low energy environments. After deposition, sediments, also called clasts, are dropped and settle out of the transporting medium. Over time, they become rock through lithification, which involves the compaction and cementation of the clasts. As pressure builds, the grains are squeezed together and minerals precipitate from water into the pore space, binding the grains and turning the loose sediment into a solid rock. Finally, through these processes, we form detrital or clastic sedimentary rocks. Some examples include shale, which is fine-grained and found furthest from its source, sandstone, which is typically well-sorted and rounded, conglomerate, which is coarse and rounded, and breccia, which is coarse and angular and found closest to its original source. The size, shape, and sorting of their grains reflect how far the sediments traveled from their source and the energy of the environment they moved through. Then we have chemical or mineral sedimentary rocks, which form when minerals precipitate out of solution, often in salt water or through evaporation. As water evaporates, dissolved minerals are left behind and crystallize. Halite and gypsum are common examples of these evaporate minerals, like deposits found at White Sands National Park. Here you can see some more examples of common chemical sedimentary rocks. These are inorganic, and it's helpful to remember what we learned in the minerals lab. Elements form to combine minerals, and those minerals can aggregate to form rock. Chemical sedimentary rocks follow that same pattern. Minerals precipitate, crystallize, and build up into solid rock layers. Finally, we have biochemical sedimentary rocks, which form through biological activity. Coal is a good example, created from compacted and altered plant material. Phosphoriferous limestone is another, formed from accumulated coral, shell fragments, and other calcium-rich remains of marine organisms. These rocks record both biological processes that created them and the environments in which those organisms lived. When learning to identify sedimentary rocks, composition tells us what the rocks are made of, whether it contains fragments, crystals, or fossils. This helps us classify a rock as detrital, chemical, or biochemical based on what its composition reveals about how it forms. Keep in mind that when something is considered microcrystalline, it means the rock contains mineral crystals, but the individual crystal shapes are too small to see without magnification. Even so, it is still classified as a chemical sedimentary rock. Another way to identify sedimentary rocks is by looking at its texture. Texture includes grain size, sorting, and roundness. These characteristics help us understand how the sediments were transported and where they were ultimately deposited. To describe grain size, we use the Wentworth scale, which also helps us interpret the energy of the environment in which the sediment settled. In the lowest energy environments, the smallest grain sizes, like clay, are deposited. In the highest energy environments, the largest grains, like pebbles, can settle. Next, we look at grain sorting, which describes how even and uniform the sediment grains are within a rock. In a poorly sorted sample, you can see very small grains mixed with much larger ones. In a well-sorted sample, the grains are all about the same size. Finally, we examine grain roundness, which ranges from angular to rounded. Roundness reflects how far the grains have traveled and how much abrasion they experienced along the way. Lastly, when identifying the depositional environment, it's important to remember that different rock types form in different settings. Fine-grained clastic rocks typically form in low-energy environments such as deep lakes or the deep ocean. Coarse-grained clastics form in high-energy environments like rivers, alluvial fans, or glaciers. Chemical sedimentary rocks often form in evaporate settings such as desert lakes and other arid basins where minerals precipitate out of solution. Biochemical rocks form in environments with abundant biological activity such as reefs, tidal flats, or shallow marine settings. Now, in this lab, you will use the ID chart to help you identify the sedimentary rocks presented to you in the lab. First, you will look at the rock's composition. Ask yourself, can I see rock fragments or sediment grains? Do I notice plant materials or pieces of broken shells? Or does the rock look like it's made mostly of crystals? Step 2 involves examining the rock's texture. Sometimes paying close attention to the descriptions on the ID chart is even more helpful, especially if you're unsure about step 1, such as when trying to identify chalk. The final step is to simply name the rock based on what you have determined in steps 1 and 2. Sometimes you can jump back and forth between looking at steps 1 and 2. Another chart you'll have access to is this one, which shows the different ways sedimentary rocks can form. Remember, detrital sedimentary rocks form from pieces of pre-existing rocks. Biochemical rocks form from materials produced by living organisms, and chemical sedimentary rocks form when minerals precipitate directly from water. This chart highlights the various processes involved in each of these pathways and helps you visualize how each rock type develops. The next chart you'll have access to shows the different grain sizes, grain roundness, and grain arrangements found in sedimentary rocks. These features help you determine how far the sedimentary rock traveled, the energy of the environment it formed in, and ultimately which sedimentary rock you're looking at. Now, when working to determine the depositional environment, start by looking at the resulting rocks column on your chart and work backwards to the location column. In the controlling processes column, think about grain size, roundness, and the amount of energy required to move and deposit that grain size. Once you understand the energy level and transport conditions, you can work back one more step to the location column, which tells you the environment where that rock type most likely formed. If you get stuck, go back over the lecture and go through the PowerPoint before reaching out. And as always, good luck.